All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this virtual event at Fordham Law's Center on National Security. I'm Karen Greenberg, the director of the center, and today's topic is the United States and today's foreign policy challenges. Since the fall of 2021 and the pullout from Afghanistan, international challenges seem to have proliferated without pause. From Yemen to the South China Sea, from Russia to Iran, from Afghanistan to Ukraine, the pressure on US foreign policymakers has remained unyielding, complex, and fraught with the instability and suffering caused by migration and climate change, by the fragility of international bodies and agreements, by cyber warfare, and by humanitarian crises worldwide. In suggesting possible options, experts and officials have offered up a variety of suggestions, from rethinking current alliances and treaty obligations to repositioning ourselves in terms of our focus. Here today, to help us sort through the current challenges and to help us understand where we may be headed as a country and a globe, are two longtime participants in Center on National Security discussions. John Brennan, former director of the CIA, former assistant to the president for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, author of Undaunted, My Fight Against America's Enemies at Home and Abroad, and most importantly, a graduate of Fordham University and a distinguished fellow for global security here at CNS. With us as well is Ali Soufan, former FBI supervisory special agent, chairman and CEO of the Soufan Group, founder of the Soufan Center, author of The Black Banners, Declassified, How Torture Derailed the War on Terror After 9/11, and a longtime friend and associate of CNS. Welcome to you both. I probably should say welcome back because you joined me in a discussion just 3 years ago to talk about the Middle East. And I think today we'll probably expand beyond that significantly. Before I get to the conversation at hand, let me remind everyone in the audience that you can put your questions in the Q&A and I will get to them as best I can. There are an awful lot of topics to cover today, so I want to get started, but I'd like to start with Ukraine and Russia, the crisis that's most in the headlights today. Days ago, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan vehemently urged Americans who are in Ukraine to leave the country, anticipating the possibility of a Russian incursion. Yesterday, the United States announced it's closing its embassy in Ukraine. Also yesterday, Ukrainian President Zelensky issued a statement that Russians could attack as early as February 16th, which is tomorrow. And overnight, reports are that Russia has pulled back some troops, if only minimally. My question to you both for starters, and John, I'm going to start with you, is how do we assess the threat of an invasion? Do you see it as an increasing threat, or does it seem that things are sort of stabilizing and that diplomacy may actually win out over a more violent resolution?
Well, Karen, it's good to be with you and Ali today and with the attendees here at the center. Yes, to say that the situation in Ukraine is dynamic would be a vast understatement at this point. Clearly, Putin has arrayed along Ukraine's border well over 100,000 Russian troops, along with various mechanized units and other types of capabilities that gives him the capability to move into Ukraine quickly. And that's why I think the warnings to the American citizens, as well as moving the embassy out of Kyiv to Lviv, are prudent steps. That said, I do not believe that Putin has made up his mind yet. I think he is giving himself the options that are available in order to continue his pressure game on Ukraine. But I do not believe that Putin has made that decision to move in, mainly because I've always considered Putin to be a rather astute observer of the international scene. And also, I think he's been very clever. And I think if he were to move in with a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, this would be his legacy. Thousands upon thousands of Ukrainians and Russians would die as a result of this type of invasion. Also, I think the type of financial sanctions that would be imposed on Russia would have a real hit on the Russian people. And so this would be, I think, Putin's legacy. And I think he turns 70 this year. So I think he's hoping that he's going to basically be president for life. And this could really give him a real black eye over time, because it's going to be a very, very costly military adventure for him. And I think it may be more likely that he's going to move into some of the eastern portions of Ukraine in Donbass and in Luhansk. But I do think that he's still trying to determine exactly what the reaction is going to be. And fortunately, I think NATO has stayed rather united in terms of its opposition to Putin. So I think he's still assessing, and despite the confidence that he shows publicly, I have a feeling that he is really, concerned and maybe a bit worried internally in terms of how he's going to finesse this matter right now, come away with what he wants, which is an assurance, an ironclad assurance that Ukraine is not going to join NATO, but at the same time, not do it at such a cost that is really going to hurt him at home and internationally.
Well, I'd like you to follow up and talk about how you see Putin, but also, TSG and TSC both have such global attention all the time. I'm wondering how the rest of the world outside of the transatlantic alliance is viewing Putin, and anything you've picked up in that regard.
First of all, thank you for having me again, John. Great to be with you and all the audience. And I hope next time we'll do it in person like we did 3 years ago. I think I agree with everything, John, with Mr. Brennan's assessment on the situation in Russia. I think Putin thought it is a good time for him to, expand his geopolitical influence in Ukraine, like he started to do a long time ago with Georgia and then Crimea. He thought that the West is weak at this point. He thought NATO might be divided. He thought the United States, we're divided among ourselves, and we won't be unified in our opposition to any violation of the sovereignty of Ukraine or the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And I think he realized that there's a lot of things he misread about the West and the United States. He forgot what makes the West and the United States strong. And I think now he's having second thought. He amassed about 100,000 troops. He got 70% of the troops needed to do a full invasion of Ukraine on the borders. He didn't do that just to have fun. He did it because he had all the intention to do so. But I think the unified reaction from the West, from NATO, the strong position of the United States in opposing his actions and supporting the Ukrainians, I think, made him have a second thought about the invasion. I think around the world, it's different. A lot of people are sympathetic to Putin because there's a lot of historical relationships between Russia and Ukraine. They think that, hey, democracy is on the decline. Authoritarian regimes are basically expanding their influence. We see that in so many different places where countries trying to go back to the same geopolitical balances that we had before World War I. You see it with Turkey, you see it with Russia, you see it with Iran, you see it with different countries around, even with the ethnic nationalism that we see on the rise. So it depends. People who are with the US and with NATO, they are more sympathetic to our position and to the Ukrainian position and NATO's position. And people who are authoritarian, they seem to be more kind of like, Ukraine. I even heard some person saying that Ukraine was always part of Russia, which basically total misunderstanding of history. If you think the history begins with the Soviet Union. It is part of the geopolitical balance that's going on today. And I think the West and the United States, we send a message that don't count democracy out yet. And we're still there. And I think Putin now is rethinking his own position on the Ukrainian borders.
John, you spent some time in Ukraine earlier in your career during the Maidan days, the Maidan Revolution. And I'm just wondering how you think, what's different between now and then in terms of Ukraine? There's been a lot of talk in the press about the presence of Russian nationalists inside Ukraine. I mean, it's one of Putin's talking points, right? How strong it is. Has anything changed? How do you see this in terms of how you saw it, 8 years ago or so?
I think a fair amount has changed. I was at Kyiv about 6 or 8 weeks after the Maidan Revolution back in 2014. And as you recall, President Yanukovych was pushed out, and he was basically a puppet of the Russian government and Putin. And so at that time, a lot of the Russian intelligence and security service and military forces had been badly infiltrated by Russia, because Russia was massaging Ukraine in order to prevent the westward expansion of NATO and EU, which is what they've been afraid of. And so at that time, even though the Russians had really degraded the independent capabilities of Ukraine, the Ukrainian forces acquitted themselves, I think, well in terms of trying to push back against that Russian incursion in the east. But over the last 8 years, there's been a fair amount of rebuilding of those forces and strengthening of the military as well as the intelligence security services. More sophisticated weaponry has gone in. As you know, the US has provided Javelin missiles to the Ukrainian forces. So I do think that there is a greater sense of cohesion within the government to try to pose opposition to Russia. I do think there is sympathy in the East because that's the area where a lot of Russian speakers are, and that's where the traditional social, family, and political relationships continue to exist across that border. So there are some deep-rooted relationships that bring portions of Ukraine and Russia together. But I do think that there is a determination now on the part of Ukraine to remain separate from Russia. And I do think that they will resist this. And that's why when I think about Russian troops and tanks rolling into Kyiv, I mean, there would be a brutal subjugation and bloody subjugation of the Ukrainian people, and then occupation. And that is going to be very, very costly for Putin and Russia, and the Russian body bags will be going back into Russia, which will hurt him. So again, as Ali said, I think that there is some recalculating that is being done by Putin right now. That doesn't mean that he's going to just turn, hide, and run. No, and I think he's looking for a way to continue to push his view that Ukraine cannot go with the West, either on the military front or even on the economic front. And he'll find ways to continue to harass, harangue, and even try to undermine the democratic processes in Ukraine. And I think we've seen that. I think there were some DDoS attacks, the dedicated denial of service attacks today on some of the Ukrainian banks. So this is the type of thing that I think Putin will opt for. I'm hoping that there's not going to be a full-scale invasion. And again, I think Putin is clever enough and smart enough now to see just how costly it will be for him, because the Ukrainian people, I think, they're not, united 100% against Russian intervention, but I think that the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians will resist and oppose that.
Just one more question on Russia, which is, what does Putin want exactly in your minds? Is it really just NATO? I know that Georgia, Bosnia, Herzegovina have also talked about wanting to join NATO. Is it really that, or is it something more dire or more aggressive? What exactly, or is it an attempt to get some attention on the world stage? I mean, what's the goal?
Look, all of the above.
Yeah.
Ali, go ahead.
No, exactly. I mean, I'm going to repeat what you said, all the above. I mean, look, Putin is worried, from the Russian perspective, they are very worried about the expansion of NATO. They believe that we violated the promise that James Baker did, that we won't go an inch eastward, after Berlin. They are fearful that this is their opportunity to make a play for it, to expand their geopolitical interests in the region. Otherwise, a lot of these countries are going to go more, be more pro-democracy and pro-West, and he is very concerned about this. He's very concerned about the energy map in Europe and in Eastern Europe and how the pipelines are going to go. So, because he thinks that that's probably can help Russia to exert influence over entities and regions that he believes it's part of the Russian sphere of influence. Remember, like if you're Russia, twice in your history, you have people just riding their army to your homeland, once during Napoleon and once during Hitler. So they are very concerned about these kind of things. And he basically uses rhetoric to to use the term that we use in terrorism, radicalize Russian-speaking people in Ukraine about these issues. But I don't think, as John said, the Ukrainians, even though they are not unified, they are not also as divided. I think even the president Zelensky, he's a Russian-speaking, Ukrainian. He is, and he's totally against, he's pro-West and totally against Russian influence. People want to have self-determination, and Putin, thinking that this is his opportunity to deprive them from doing this. So there are many different reasons, but the stuff that they are talking about in Russia makes sense to many Russian people and makes sense to their allies. But I think they understand that the world is very different than it used to be before. And the situation in Ukraine probably will be a disastrous situation for Russia. It might be Russia's Afghanistan in case they invaded.
Okay, so one of the things both of you have said is basically that the Atlantic Alliance has held, that the robustness and agreement among the NATO countries has held when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine crisis. But what about the Middle East? If we switch to the Middle East and we look at alliances, it seems that so much is shifting that, if we go back to your conversation of the two of you had 3 years ago, we're looking at a very different Middle East, or at least that's the question I'm going to pose. I mean, this week, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett met with Bahraini Crown Prince and Prime Minister Salman bin Hamad Al Khalifa to discuss strengthening bilateral ties. I think this is, in the wake of the Abraham Accords. I mean, how do you see and Ali, I'm going to start with you here. How do you see this realignment of the Middle East, and where is it going to be that in a way this is the US's exit card, that as the Middle East realigns itself, that maybe the United States can focus elsewhere? I mean, or not?
I won't go as far. And I think a lot of the things that we see now with Bahrain and the Emirates, it's really great that we see people talking to each other. But this conversation used to happen behind closed doors or under the table. Now it's happening in the open. I think the situation in the Middle East 3 years ago did not change as much as it is today. Yemen is still a mess. Syria is still a mess. Iraq is still a mess. The leadership of the United States is needed more than ever today in the region to protect our allies, to protect countries that depend on us. And we can make the decision to ignore the reality as it exists and suffer the consequences of our ignoring that reality, or take a leadership position and try to solve a lot of these issues and be part of the solution. Look, Iran is expanding its influence. I think its influence today is way more significant than it used when even President Trump took over. I think we can see what's happening now with the Houthis in Yemen. We can see it re-exerted its influence again with Hamas after they had a big problem during the Syrian civil war between them and Hamas. We see Hezbollah now is stronger than many regional countries in the region. We see Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi is extremely influential in Iraq. They infiltrated not only the Iraqi security service, but also the Iraqi military. Turkey also is trying to exert its influence, not only in Syria, but also in Europe, through the Turkish communities in Germany and in Sweden and other places, and in Central Asia through Turkic and ethnic relationship with other countries. And I think now we see many of these countries in the region using non-state actors in order to do their bidding. Not only Iran using non-state actors, Turkey, other countries also using non-state actors. We see them in Yemen. We also only focus on the Houthis, but we don't focus on the other militias that's working either for the Saudis or for the Emiratis against the Houthis. We see that also in Libya. And in other, we even saw non-state actors being moved to take part of the war in Azerbaijan, in Nagorno-Karabakh, between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So I think we have to be very careful. We cannot just exit the Middle East. Always in the Middle East, we have two top of priorities, oil and the state of Israel. And I think we don't need the oil as much, but there are a lot of other situations that might cause, overwhelming chaos in the region that's going to suck us back to the Middle East. That's why I think diplomacy is essential now to try to solve these problems that is radicalizing thousands, if not millions of people. And again, if we ignore it today, we're going to be dealing with it tomorrow.
John, you spent your professional life in and out of the Middle East. How do you see what's happening today? Is it a game changer? Is it a realignment of alliances? And in particular, I'm curious about the role that the UAE right now is playing and the Saudis. Just curious about your thoughts.
I think, as Ali eloquently stated, there are so many things going on in the Middle East that I don't think the United States can turn its back at all. Not in light of the current conditions there, some of the humanitarian disasters that exist. I think we do have an obligation to try to address some of that, but also because there is the potential for there to be more conflict and bloodshed in the future. When I look at the countries of Syria and Yemen and Iraq, but in addition, look at Libya and Lebanon, two other countries that are facing some serious internal challenges and issues. I do think the Biden administration is determined to try to get Iran to get back into some type of agreement on the nuclear front to resuscitate the JCPOA. And so I do think that there's going to be that determination there. Washington, the Biden administration, I think, is working with the Emiratis and the Saudis to try to soften some of their opposition to an Iranian deal. But at the same time, I think there's concerns that there are sufficient extremist forces and radical forces throughout the region that we cannot turn our eyes away from the concerns about ISIS, Al-Qaeda. So I think there's a lot that is still worrisome. Now, I do believe that there are the positive developments of the fact that Naftali Bennett is in Bahrain and establishing relations with other Arab states, the Emiratis, the Sudanese and Moroccans, and I think that's positive. When I think about Tunisia, which was really the only country that was really moving after the Arab Spring along a path of democracy, I think the Tunisians are realizing that democracy is messy these days, and that's why I do think that they're now concerned about some of the measures that are being put in place that are restricting some of those democratic reforms. So I do think that with everything else that's going on in the world, the United States still has people dedicated to focusing on the Middle East. And last but not least, certainly from my perspective, is the plight of the Palestinian people. I think that is still something that needs to be addressed. Unfortunately, the Abraham Accords really did nothing to advance the interests of the Palestinian people, other than to get Netanyahu to back off of a very unlawful threat to basically annex the occupied territory. So I am hoping that there's going to be continued attention and that the Saudis and the Emiratis will try to advance the interests, the aspirations of the Palestinian people. Because clearly, not just in terms of what's going on the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but it's critically important as far as the stability of Jordan, population of which is more than half Palestinian. So again, I think while all eyes may be riveted on Ukraine and concerned about China's global growth and expansion, the Middle East has more than enough issues that I think will keep the administration involved for years to come.
So I hear you. So we're not moving out of the Middle East, which I kind of knew. I was just poking you. I'm glad you brought up the Palestinians. I see that in so often in all of this talk about the realliances, it's sort of, well, what about the Palestinians? And it doesn't always get addressed. Do you think that that's like a second stage, or do you think right now, in terms of a lot of what's going on, there is some kind of sense that the issue of the Palestinians needs to be attended to in a constructive way?
Well, unfortunately, I think the occupation that has existed for the past 55 years or so has put the facts on the ground, and Unfortunately, with the continued growth of settlements, which encroach upon traditional Palestinian homelands and some of their settlements there, it's really quite disturbing to me, having spent a fair amount of time in Palestine. It's not a real driving force in the Middle East the way it used to be years ago. Ali knows well, with the various periods of Palestinian nationalism and terrorism, how the world's attention was riveted to a Yasser Arafat at the UN, or on the very, very horrific attacks by Abu Nidal and others. It seems to be in the back burner, and I'm glad that we don't have that Palestinian terrorism. However, the plight of the Palestinian people, I think, still needs to be addressed. So it's one of those things that's festering out there. I'm hoping that there's not going to be some type of trigger, as we saw in the two intifadas. The two Palestinian intifadas were triggered by individual incidents. First instance was a car crash that killed some Palestinians at one of the refugee camps. The other one was Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount, which can set off a wave of violence that not just lead to deaths of Palestinians, but also pose, I think, serious security challenges and threats to the state of Israel.
Yeah. I want to turn to Afghanistan, but first, Ali, I'd really like your sense, which you referred to before, about what actually is happening in the world of global terrorism, and in particular with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The killing of al-Qurayshi recently. What is I know that you've done some thinking about what this actually means for global terrorism. I'm curious what you think about the future, both of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Experts around the world seem to be divided on how they see the threat, and where you think the future leadership of ISIS will be, and just how you see the impact globally of this.
Look, you know what? I think we killed Baghdadi, and then we killed Qurayshi, and then before we killed Osama bin Laden, but you cannot kill a narrative and ideology. The ideology is still rooted there. There are millions of people who started to believe in this, and some of these people, fraction of them, have been radicalized, and they joined these organizations. Look at Al-Qaeda before 9/11. Literally, they have a lot of supporters, but they had probably about 400 pledged members, people who actually took an oath to Osama bin Laden to become part of Al-Qaeda. If you look at Al-Qaeda today, just with the pledged members, there's probably more than 40,000 people, and very few in Syria, because they get divided into Al-Nusra and other groups. I think the only group that's still loyal to Al-Qaeda Central is Hurras ad-Din, but you have them in the Islamic Maghreb, what they call Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and the Sahel region. You have them in Somalia. They are stronger than they were before. You have different groups in Yemen and so forth that's benefiting directly from the civil war in Yemen. They have strong local leadership. But I think one of the things that have been done correctly by the US is weakening the global leadership for the organization. That it does not mean that if you don't have a new guy coming like an Osama bin Laden or somebody who's known and trusted and charismatic, that cannot put all these entities together again under a global network. ISIS is a little bit different. ISIS today is where Al-Qaeda was after 9/11. I think they get the brunt of the U.S. and our allies' military actions. They have about 10,000 people in jail in SDF territories, and this is something that we need to focus on, because if these guys escaped or ISIS was able to get some of them out, that's going to be a big problem in the region. They are active now in Syria. They are rebuilding their network in some areas, especially in Al-Badiya. They are active in Western Iraq again. And they are building affiliates in Mozambique and Africa and other places around the world. I think the difference between ISIS and Al-Qaeda is ISIS have that management model of McDonald's. Basically, McDonald's in India don't have Big Mac, don't have beef. Whatever works in India, whatever makes money for McDonald's in India, that's what they will do. Al-Qaeda is doing the same thing. Al-Qaeda's operation and strategy in Sahel, for example, is very different than it is in Yemen. That's actually closer to Osama bin Laden's narrative, very different than it is in Syria, and so forth. ISIS have the Starbucks model. Whatever the leadership says, everybody has to do. All the affiliates have to go under that. Al-Qaeda used to be that before 9/11, but after 9/11, after they lost Afghanistan, they changed. Today, we have more terrorists than we used to have before 9/11. We have more areas that's controlled by non-state actors than we used to have before 9/11. Before 9/11, we had Kandahar. Few of them were in Kabul. Few of them were fighting alongside the Taliban against Ahmad Shah Massoud and the Northern Alliance. A couple of safe houses in Yemen. A couple of branches, very small, in hiding, trying to operate under Al-Qaeda's banners, but Osama bin Laden refused, because if you want to be Al-Qaeda member, you have to go to Afghanistan and do the hijrah, the migration. Now the situation is very different, and it is actually, in a way, I'm very nervous about it, especially with Afghanistan going back to, it seems, at least it's not there yet, but it seems it's going back to the past that it used to be, after the Soviets pulled out from Afghanistan. I think Al-Qaeda have a strategy. It's called the management of savagery. The management of savagery has 3 stages. Stage 1, you attack the global and the regional order. Stage 2, after that collapse, you prevent anyone to fill the vacuum, because as bin Laden said, whoever is going to fill the vacuum is going to be the new agent for the Americans. 3, you establish states in these areas, and by building relationship with tribes, with political allies, and that's a long-term strategy. And then you connect all these states together to create a caliphate. The problem with ISIS, they jumped from phase 1 to phase 3 without going to phase 2. Strategically, Al-Qaeda have been very successful in playing stage 2 and operating under the radar. They are very successful in the Sahel region. They're very successful in Somalia, in Yemen, in other locations around the world. We need to pay attention to that. Yes, they are focusing on local issues, because that's what phase 2 is all about. But towards the end, their goal is very global. Let's not forget that. ISIS, I think they will be eventually reach to where Al-Qaeda reached after many years. But I think their situation today, I'm more worried, frankly, strategically in the long term. I'm more worried about Al-Qaeda than about ISIS.
That's really interesting. John, put this in perspective for us. We have been fighting the war on terror for 20 years. And from the way Ali tells it, we're things have gotten worse, not better. There's been a proliferation of just terrorist groups lining up with one another. What's happening? Is the world, I just want big picture. Is the world really changing in terms of how we think about borders? And, you brought up proxy actors before, Ali, in terms of how we understand the organization of the world. Is the narrative really the same? Or has the group stayed the same and the narrative and the grievance and the goal change? And I'm just curious from your point of view, how you see this evolution.
Well, as we know, violence has been used as a political tool for millennia in all different parts of the world and cultures and whatever. I think over the last 40, 50 years, we've seen the evolution of terrorism that emanates from the Middle East, a lot of it putting up a false banner of Islam, taking advantage of the discontent and disenfranchisement of so many individuals, and trying to exploit local conditions. And so when you have people like Baghdadi or bin Laden or others, these are individuals who very cleverly are able to rally people behind them, pointing to the opponents of either individuals or of Muslims, and trying to then take advantage also increasingly, I think, and this is where I think one of the changes is taking place, of the technology that has become available. The ISIS developed at a time very different than Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda back in the late 80s or 90s, the internet wasn't even around until the 1990s. While ISIS, with its clarion call, pulled people from so many different parts of the world, and a lot of them with the technical skills that could be exploited in that digital domain. And so I do think that the ability of some of these terrorist organizations to be able to take advantage of the advancements in technology as far as communication, propaganda, different types of explosive capabilities and other things. And so I do think that we're seeing, again, this evolution. But when I look at the Middle East now, and I think about just how difficult the environments are in places like Syria and Yemen and Libya and Iraq, I think they're still very ripe for exploitation by individuals who are going to use whatever rallying cry they can to get people on the bandwagon. And I do think that this is going to be a challenge that we'll be facing over time. It's terrorism is going to be with us. And I think as Ali said, what we can do is we can disrupt a lot of their activities. Taking out the bin Ladens and Baghdadis and Qurayshis and others really is quite disruptive to these activities. And so what we're trying to do is to gain some time and space so we can make some inroads, not just downstream against the leaders and the operatives, but also maybe upstream to try to address some of those conditions. But again, when I think about Yemen, between the Houthis and Al-Qaeda, AQAP there, the conditions there are not going to improve anytime soon. And again, it's just very fertile ground for individuals who are going to be able to attract, especially very young individuals, to get behind them, especially when they believe that if they martyr themselves, they are going to have a much better afterlife.
I just push on one thing. You said the conditions aren't going to improve anytime soon. Why not? What would make those? It's just because we know that because we've tried so hard and the world has tried so hard and internally and externally. What's the acceptance of the fact that it can't be helped in shorter amount of time rather than longer?
Well, I think there's been an entire generation, if not more, of Syrians and Yemenis who have been deprived of educational opportunities, medical care, employment opportunities, other types of things. I'm not saying that progress cannot be made against it. I think it can make some progress. But what I'm saying is that the conditions in those countries are not going to dramatically improve in the short term. The reconstruction of these countries, I'm not just talking about the physical reconstruction, I'm talking about the social reconstruction of these countries when they're still beset by these various sectarian fissures and conflicts and strife and tensions. And so when we look at, we haven't talked about Afghanistan yet, but Afghanistan obviously is an environment where there's not just a looming humanitarian disaster, there is one right now. So I do think that these are going to be unfortunate well springs for extremism to be able to make some additional gains at the expense of political stability and security.
Yeah. Let's turn to Afghanistan. The humanitarian situation in Afghanistan doesn't seem to be getting better, although there's a number of things that have been tried and are being tried just this week. Ali, where do you see this headed, and what can be done, in your opinion, to sort of take care? And I think one of the real questions becomes, where do you stand on, is it important or necessary or possible to recognize the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan?
I mean, look, we have to deal with the reality on the ground. And if the United States saying now, oh, we don't want to recognize the Taliban, or somebody is saying that, well, that ship has sailed. We negotiated with the Taliban under the Obama administration, under the Trump administration, and under the Biden administration. So we already recognized them when we sat with them in Doha, Qatar, and negotiated with them, regardless how you feel about that negotiation or what the negotiations led to. Now we have a situation on the ground that the Taliban are in control of Afghanistan, and there is a big humanitarian problem happening or on its way to happen. And either we have to deal with the Afghani government, and we already did something positive, I think, by the administration did something positive about lifting the sanctions around the humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. But also at the same time, we need to engage with them. Now, they are fighting ISIS, ISIS Khorasan. And not because they like us, they are fighting it because they are their enemies. It's like Al Qaeda and ISIS; they don't like each other. It's basically the same conflict between ISIS-K and the Taliban. But also at the same time, the Taliban, we forget that they're not monolithic. There's a lot of anger in the U.S. and in the West in general about Haqqani being the acting interior minister, and some other folks on the Afghani government are either listed or sanctioned by terrorists listed in the U.S. or sanctioned by the UN. I think probably more than half of their government is sanctioned by the UN at this point. So that's definitely creates some concerns. But also at the same time, they have been able to control the country. So far, we don't have daily bombings and the stuff that used to happen before. So they are capable in controlling the country. The problem is what's going to happen now if the resources started to disappear in Afghanistan because they don't have much resources. A lot of these, different commanders, they're going to start fighting with each other, fighting over resources. That is going to create a problem in Afghanistan. This is exactly what happened when all the Mujahideen leaders, after the aid stopped fighting the Soviets, start fighting with each other. My concern that is going to impact significantly the Afghani people and the stability of Afghanistan. Then terrorist groups are going to come in. Then history is going to repeat itself. So I think we have to change the way we are thinking about Afghanistan, because if we don't change the way we are thinking about Afghanistan, we will definitely recycle our experiences in Afghanistan and in the terrorism that comes from Afghanistan. So we have a reality on the ground. We like it or we don't. They are in control of the country. We like it or we don't. If it goes on the wrong path, it will create a significant problem, not only for the region, but also for the United States. And I think this is a stage, instead of looking the other way, maybe we can start helping the Afghani people and allowing aids to go to the Afghani people until we figure out what's going on with that government. But it takes, it's a two-way street situation. You can't say, I want to engage the world, and you put people who are, on the most wanted terrorist list as part of your government either. But I think there's a lot of things the administration need to focus on with Afghanistan. I fear that we need to be extremely careful on how to deal with the different components that make up the Taliban and what's going on with Afghanistan, with the different ethnic groups, with the different, with the Haqqani network. If we're not engaging, our adversaries does not mean our adversaries are not engaging. The Indians are there, the Pakistanis are there, the Iranians are there, the Russians are there, the Chinese are trying to get there. So I think we need to I think we have more experience than many of these, some of these countries, not many of them, in the region. We've been in Afghanistan for a long time, and I think we have an opportunity to think about politics, think about diplomacy, think of playing smart without necessarily having troops on the ground, and how to deal with the situation before it exploded in our face, like it exploded in our face in 1989 after the Soviets left the country.
John, I want to bring you in here. Do you see this the same way? And if you do or don't, I'm curious about the Biden administration and exactly, where we should place them in terms of their willingness to actually engage with the Taliban, and how you see that.
I fully agree with Ali. I think the Biden administration and other governments, other Western governments, need to do a lot more in order to address a looming disaster within Afghanistan. There are certain realities, and the Taliban are in control. And yes, I'm glad that the Biden administration last week, with an executive order, freed up some money to go into the humanitarian organizations to trying to address some of those humanitarian needs. But the humanitarian organizations, the UN and others, cannot handle the scale of the requirements in Afghanistan. There needs to be an effort to try to distinguish between the Taliban leadership, as I said, a lot of them are sanctioned, and the government ministries and the civil servants and others and the Central Bank of Afghanistan. I think that we need to be able to provide additional money into the coffers of the Afghan government in order to address the needs of the Afghan people. There need to be additional licenses. The Treasury Department gave some licenses for monies to go into humanitarian organizations. I think they need to give licenses to go into some of these Afghan government ministries and groups that really need to take care of the needs of the Afghan people. I remember when I was at the White House, this was back in like 2012 or so, there was a lot of concern about the Somali humanitarian requirements. And there was opposition within the US government to allowing aid to go through al-Shabaab territories because they were taking tolls on some of the roads there. And so I pushed very hard to allow these tolls to be paid because it was preventing this humanitarian assistance from getting through. So when I think about our counterterrorism efforts over the years, and Afghanistan was really for that, it was to save lives. And so now I think what we have to do is everything possible to save lives in Afghanistan, being mindful about making sure that we're not going to allow terrorism to thrive under the Taliban leadership there. It's going to be a delicate balance. And yes, some money will be siphoned off into Taliban coffers. But when you look at all the money that was, went into corruption during our presence in Afghanistan, I think it pales in comparison. So again, I do think we need to do a lot more. The Taliban are not going to go away. I think we need to be smart about how we do it. But I do think trying to set up a parallel humanitarian support structure with these other organizations is not going to address the needs of the Afghan people.
Really interesting. Following on that, I'm going to start bringing in some questions. Lawrence Wright has a question about refugees. The world is awash in refugees, especially in the Muslim world. We've heard about terrorist recruiters in refugee camps. How do you assess this population as a possible reservoir for future terrorists? And what, if anything, can be done to abate the problem? And Ali, I think that, that follows along the lines of what you were saying, and then I'll get to other questions. But
yeah, look, absolutely. I mean, you have millions and millions of young people in the Middle East who are refugees. Look at the situation in Syria, in Al-Hol camp. The world is just ignoring that disaster. Al-Hol today is basically an ISIS city. I talk to people from humanitarian organizations that go in, they want to look for someone, and basically it's all controlled by ISIS. They take somebody from one tent to another, so the Red Cross, the International Red Cross, cannot find that child or whatever the situation is. The problem, it's a significant problem. Remember, early on, we talked about Yemen and the humanitarian situation in Yemen. If you're a Zaidi or you're a Sunni or whatever you are, if you're from the north or if you're from the south, and you're a refugee and you don't have food and you don't feel secure and you don't feel protected, you look at the Qaeda guys, or you look at the Houthis, Ansarullah, or you look at whoever you look at, and they're going to be your heroes. They're going to be your saviors. You're going to be recruited. You're going to be an extremist. I think, frankly, I'm really kind of, surprised that we don't have more kids that's recruited by these organizations. And that has a lot to do with, their families, their upbringing, the culture that they are in, that's preventing many people from being recruited. But even if you recruit 1% or 2%, of the millions of people who are refugees all across the Muslim world, that is going to create a huge disaster down the road. And we need to pay attention to this. I go back to the situation with Al-Hol. Thousands and thousands of people, 10,000 fighters. Those are not in Al-Hol. Those are different camps. But the families, the children, many are Westerns and Europeans, and the Europeans are not taking back their citizens. What's going to happen to them when they are released? What's going to happen to that kid when went to Al-Hol 5-6 years ago, and he was 10 and now he's 15 or 16 years old? What kind of what kind of citizen do you think he's going to be? He's citizen only to one state that doesn't exist, called ISIS, the so-called Islamic State. So we need to pay attention to this. And I think, again, we can ignore all these problems, but I can guarantee you down the road, we're going to pay a heavy price for ignoring these problems. They cost less now to deal with them than they're going to cost down the road. And if you don't remember, if you forget about 9/11, remember it again.
John, I'm going to bunch up a couple of questions here on Russia and go to you, John, for this. One is Alexander Cohn. The latest threat of Russian invasion is very different from the covert hybrid warfare approach of the 2014 incursion. Does that suggest it's strategic stable rattling now? And another one, which is, wait, let me find it, from Mike Jankowicz. To what extent does the Ukrainian operation have to do with Putin's domestic problems? And so either one of those or both of those that you can comment on. I mean, a lot of people, a lot of experts have raised the sort of, Russia's running out of money, right? Russia's spread too thin. What's happening with Russia domestically? Your thoughts?
Well, it might be an effort to divert, but I think even if it has the short-term benefit of maybe diverting attention, I think it is long-term problematic for Putin for the reasons we talked about. These financial sanctions talking about, if Russia is not able to participate basically in the international financial environment, I mean, that's going to be really, really costly. And Nord Stream 2, will absolutely be dead. There are other things that I think is going to really hurt a lot of Russians. And then also just the body bags that are coming back. So I don't think it's a very good way to address any of those domestic problems. I do think that Putin has a number of challenges that he needs to address, but unfortunately, I don't think this is the right way to do it. Yes, what he's doing right now is much different than what happened in 2014 when he was sending those little green men across the border and engaging in these paramilitary and covert operations. I do think there's a fair amount of saber rattling. Some Russians saying that this finally is getting the attention of the West. And so maybe Putin is going to package this that it was only with the threat of invasion was NATO and the United States able to provide some type of reassurance that there's not going to be this westward march. And this is really a fabricated crisis, that Putin is claiming, because there's no intention that Ukraine is going to join NATO in the near term at all. Yes, I know that people and Ukrainian officials have said that is their true ambition, but there is nothing right now on NATO's agenda to do that, and I think they would avoid that because they know that would be very provocative at this point. So yes, this is different, but again, I think both Ali and I were saying that maybe Putin miscalculated a bit, or he's recalculating now, taking into account the various reactions to that saber rattling.
A couple of questions have come in about the JCPOA. And, these talks have been on again, off again. They seem to be taking forever. It's like Ukraine, we don't really know which direction they're headed. I'd like to know from both of you, kind of in answering these questions in the sort of aggregate, what do you see as the chances for this deal being made in the near future? And how important is it that the deal get remade? Ali, let's start with you.
Well, frankly, it's all up to the Iranians. I mean, definitely, we want to have a deal. We have already had a deal with them before President Trump stopped it, but they want to go back to the situation as it was when we had a deal with them at the first time. Well, during the time period when President Trump exited that deal, they did a lot of things, but they don't want to count any of these kind of things in the new agreement. And I think it is very, a lot of people are saying, oh, the Biden administration really want to win. Well, not really, because if they wanted to win, they could have had the deal already. But I think we want the right deal with Iran, a deal that can, enhance global security, regional security, take into account our allies and our friends in the region. So yeah, it's up to the Iranians. I believe the Iranians probably know that this is an opportunity for them, and I think at the bottom line, it's only fair to basically discuss all the bad things that they did. I mean, I'm calling it bad things, but you know what I mean, all the nuclear development or the technological advances that they did in the years when they were out of the JCPO. We need to go back to that as well.
John, you agree with that, or you want to add anything? Or
Yeah, I'm, whether I should be or not, I'm optimistic that within the next few months, maybe even shorter than that, that there's going to be some type of return. But as Ali says, we have to take into account what has happened over the last several years. No deal with Iran is going to be perfect, and it's not going to meet all of the requirements of people, including in Congress. But the last thing we want, I think, is for Iran to continue this march toward nuclear weapons development, increasing stockpiles, increasing centrifuge production of fissile material. And so I think it's going to be a continued negotiations, but I am hoping that some recent indicators suggest that the Iranians are more amenable now to a new deal.
John, let me just ask you a final question, and then I'll ask Ali. The pivot to Asia, where we got through this whole hour and never really talked about the pivot to Asia. What do you see as the future evolution of this sort of brewing confrontation between the United States and China? What signposts can we look for? What concerns should we have? How do you envision the future?
Well, I think it's going to be a challenging one because China continues its global march, and Xi Jinping and Chinese leaders have been very strategic, and they have not been beset by real domestic political cycles. And so they've been able to maintain this Belt and Road Initiative over time. Later this year, there's going to be the Chinese Party Congress meeting where I guess Xi Jinping will be reelected, and because term limits now have been removed. So there are areas of real concern, and I'm not just talking on the trade front, I'm talking about the Chinese influence, not just in the region of East Asia and Southeast Asia, but also across South Asia and into Africa. A lot of their commercial, trade, and business activities are being undergirded by military base development, security intelligence ties, and other things. And so they are patient, they're strategic, and I think they are determined. And so I do think that the Biden administration is very serious about trying to address the totality of the Chinese challenge. There are areas where we can, in fact, deconflict, areas maybe we can coordinate or collaborate. But I think there's going to be a fair amount of tension in some of these areas, particularly when it comes to technology and it comes to some of the issues that I think China is posing a serious threat, not just to ourselves, but also to our allies and partners around the globe.
Ali, how would you see, and this is the final question, how do you see the pivot to Asia as it's referred to, and in particular in its intersection with global terrorism and the threat of global terrorism?
Okay, I agree with what John mentioned, and I think we lost a few years. We started the pivot to Asia under the Obama administration, actually a little bit also before, and I think we just looked the other way, thinking the problem is going to go away. And we have a lot of allies, at least 11 countries in the region, that want that strategic American leadership in the region, want a strategic anchor for the United States in the region. And I think it is important for all the reasons that John mentioned to do so. But also at the same time, I think China, I'm doing a lot of the stuff that John brilliantly mentioned. But also at the same time, if you see their alliances now in Central Asia, for example, it's all alliances based on counterterrorism. They are trying to use our strategy in building counterterrorism relationships with other countries to protect the Road and Belt Initiative. I think they have been benefiting from the international system that the United States led and established and protected. And I think it is time to, start to hold them accountable and challenge the influence that they are trying to do in threatening their neighbors and threatening countries around them. And that's what Pivot to Asia was all about until we, like the Iran deal, we pulled out of it. Now we're trying to catch up.
Yeah, we're out of time. I learned a lot. I hope our listeners and watchers learned a lot. Let's try to do this again. Let's not wait 3 years. And let's try to do it in person if possible. But thank you both so much for being willing to guide us all through these current times. We will see you, all of you, next time.
Thanks, Ali. Great seeing you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
John.
everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Karen.
Take care.